everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a fox in graphite. Now my aim for this project was to show that with the right techniques, focusing on the right layering process, contrast and pencil technique, that we can still create a realistic drawing when working on a smaller scale. Now one of the biggest considerations with a portrait like this is that we don't want to be trying to draw in every single detail, but we want to be focusing on the values that hint at that level of realism. Now an example here when drawing the eyes are so small that I can only really focus on those main lights and darks. I've still hinted as much as I can at a bright reflection and the dark value around the eye and the pupil, but I don't want to be trying to draw detail in the iris. Now this is going to become more apparent as I work on more sections of the fur. I'm still focusing on building up my layers gradually, reinforcing that contrast with each layer that I add. I'm going to be using the key blending techniques, how to soften the layers of graphite and so on, but making sure I don't get too carried away and adding in lots of individual pencil strokes is going to be very, very important throughout this drawing. Now as you can see here, I'm still focusing on all of the key techniques such as fur length, fur thickness and fur direction. I want to still be making sure that I'm getting all of that correct because that is still going to help build up that realistic shape and form of the animal. But as I build up my values here from that very first layer, I'm always focusing on how soft that fur should be. Now I like to create a softness in my details when I'm actually working with the graphite pencils rather than always relying on my softening and blending tools. I do of course use those throughout my layers, but making sure those pencil strokes look soft initially can really help. Now this is something that I do cover thoroughly in the real-time tutorials, and all of that information is linked in the description below if they are of interest. Now as I continue to work with the fur here, you can see that I'm using a couple of my different erasers. Primarily here I'm using my putty eraser and a Tombow mono eraser. But what I'm not doing is just blocking in a solid layer of graphite and then trying to force my highlights on top. Now this method can work for some situations, but when working on a smaller scale here, I like to be as accurate as I can because it's going to make it a lot easier when trying to fit in this level of detail in these small sections. So being more accurate right from the beginning, I find certainly makes drawing on a smaller scale far more enjoyable and definitely less stressful. Take this ear here for example, I'm making sure to block in where my darker areas are, but I'm always still hinting at that fur texture as well. Now this is of course the same approach when I work on my larger projects, but here when working on a smaller scale, this is even more important just to make sure that we don't end up getting an area too overworked, which can definitely be more easily achieved when working on these smaller projects. Now the nose, for example, is very similar to the eyes in that I'm only going to block in my main lights and darks rather than trying to hint at lots of individual detail. Here I want to be making sure that I've got the nostrils in the right place and the outside shape of the nose is correct. Now if there's anything wrong with the nose, such as the nostril position and so on, then it is very distracting, and even if someone doesn't have the original reference photo, it's usually obvious if the nose isn't drawn right. So it's something where I really want to take that time to get each step accurate before I move on. Now one of the reasons I've made more of these smaller projects is because I've been speaking to a lot of artists lately about that feeling of being burnt out. They want to be at the easel but are feeling a bit overwhelmed, they're not quite in the zone, and there are a couple of different things that can help overcome all of that. Now for me personally, I find working on smaller projects that we can get done in 2 to 3 hours is a great way of achieving that sense of satisfaction from creating a realistic drawing in a shorter space of time. If we're already feeling a little bit burnt out and then we jump into a project that's time consuming and complex, then I think that that's not going to help that feeling and we're going to get more stressed. So when I do start to feel a little bit overwhelmed, I always try to fit in a smaller project because we're using all of those key fundamental techniques that are required for larger pieces that have more detail, that we maybe want to be focusing on a specific technique that we're trying to improve, but it's all done within a smaller period of time. So these projects are something that I personally like to fit in every now and then throughout my drawing schedule because they really just help overall with so many different factors. Now, I've briefly spoken about the importance of fur length, fur thickness and fur direction, but as I start to work on the body here, all of those things are becoming more visible. Now, the fur direction here, it curves in a few different ways, and this is going to help build up that shape and form of the animal. So I want to be making sure that I've got that accurate. Now, when working on a smaller scale, we're only able to add in a selection of those details in each of the areas. But by making sure that we're focusing on the fur length, fur thickness and the fur direction, it is looking realistic without there having to be hundreds of individual pencil strokes. Now, even though it is a smaller section and it does get completed at a quicker rate, it doesn't mean that I'm skipping through my layering process. As you can see here, I'm still making sure to build up my layers gradually. I'm not jumping into my darkest pencil first. I'm building up the layers of softness, and then I'm coming in and refining the contrast with my darker values before I pull in some of my highlights. Now, all of the steps that I'm using here are the same if I was drawing this fox on a larger size. But of course, working on a larger project, we just have more space to add in those finer details. But in terms of how to build up the contrast, how to use the pencils, how to use the erasers, all of those techniques are the same. This is why these smaller projects are so beneficial. Now, one big tip when drawing fur is if you're working on a section of fur that needs to be quite bright, so like for example the highlight on the top of the back there just above the shoulder, if I needed that to be brighter, then I can do two things. The first is I allow the white of the paper to show through, which I've done here, and then I can darken that up in stages if I need to. The other thing is if I have allowed the white of the paper to be visible and I still want that to look lighter, but I know I physically can't get that any brighter because it is the paper colour there that's showing, then that's an indication that the fur next to it needs to be made darker. Now, by darkening up that section of fur, it will automatically make that highlight look brighter, and this would be the case with any part of the drawing. So for example, a highlight in the eye where the white of the paper has been left, if that highlight is still looking dull, then that is an indication that the area around the eye needs to be made darker. It could be the pupil, it could be the eyelid area, or the fur itself. Now, one thing that really drew me to selecting the reference photo for this project was how the fox was photographed. I loved the angle and the pose. It's very different to many other photographs of red foxes. But because of how the fox is standing here, the area of the fur on the back end by the tail, it's almost like it changes direction very quickly. It comes across from left to right and then drops down towards the lower edge of the paper. Now, this angle and that quick change of direction is really important to capture, but it's quite tempting to make both sections of fur almost join together and we make more of a gradual slope and change of direction. Now, what that can actually cause is it makes the body look too long. Having that quick change of fur direction where it does drop down towards the lower edge of the paper makes that back end there look like it's actually turned more towards the camera. So it's really important here when working with whole portraits where we're drawing the full body, but of course head and shoulders would be exactly the same, is that any sharp change of fur direction is needing to be captured. This is going to make a real difference to overall how realistic that portrait is going to look. Now, of course, the contrast and the values will coincide with that. So where the fur direction changes, if you've got a dark shadow and there is a bright highlight above it, it's important to capture that. Now, the placement of the highlights and shadows are not random. They also follow the underlying bone and muscular structure, just as the fur direction. So for example here, that dark area on the lower edge of the body, that's hinting of where the stomach is curving under towards the underside of the fox. The shadow here on the back leg is being cast by the tail. So all of these things here are going to have an impact for the overall piece. Now, one other aspect that I cover thoroughly in my real-time step-by-step lessons, which is again all linked in the description below, is the importance of drawing the right layer at the right time. Now, when I worked on the tail here, I was very tempted to work on the tail first. It's one of the things that I find is more impressive about the reference photo, and of course it's what makes that red fox so iconic. But I needed to make sure that I did the tail last because the fur here is on top and sitting above the back legs in front of the front leg. So being able to draw what's behind it first and then adding in these details on top is going to again also help with that level of realism. Now, for example, if I had drawn the tail first and then I tried drawing the legs around it, I'm going to have to draw around all of those lovely details on the edge of the tail. Now, sometimes I feel that can actually create a little bit more of a harsh edge to the details, and it looks like they have been drawn separately. So this is something that I prefer to avoid. Now, even though the legs are very dark because they are in shadow, I need to be making sure that I'm using the right techniques with my erasers to pull in any highlights over the top of those where needed. Now, being able to incorporate those highlights, as I am here with my Tombow mono eraser, is something that can be quite tricky. Now, getting a Tombow mono eraser to lift those fine highlights, I find is more easily achieved if the graphite has been applied in the right way to start with. Now, one of the biggest factors that makes using a Tombow mono eraser harder is if the layers of graphite have been applied with too much of a heavy hand. So if burnishing has occurred, which is where we have flattened the tooth of the paper at the early stages by using too much pressure on the pencils, then that is more likely to make it far harder to lift that graphite off the paper when the erasers are used. And of course, all aspects of using erasers, how to make them work to their best potential and so on, is something that I do cover in all of my step-by-step lessons. Now at this very last stage, I just come back in here, spending a few minutes adjusting my contrast. So this could be darkening my shadows or lightening some of the highlights, just to make sure that I've got that spot on. Now the very last element that I add once those changes have been made are the whiskers. Because they are sitting on top of everything else and they do overlap all sections of that fur, I like to make sure that they are the last element that is added. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.